$2 million buys a penthouse overlooking the bay or a yacht wide enough to bury 3 bodies. It doesn't buy back a soul. Reed Ashford didn't plan on stepping inside that rotting warehouse. He sat in the black Maybach, his fingers turning the silver ring on his left hand, listening to the rain hammer the roof like fists on a coffin lid, waiting for Tate to handle the debtor and be done with it. He hated mud. He hated blood on his leather shoes. But Tate called out, his voice different than usual. "Boss, you need to see this." Behind a false wall in Perry Voss's warehouse, there was a cellar. 4 girls were chained to rusted water pipes. 3 of them screamed when the door opened. The 4th sat silent in the darkest corner, back straight, eyes open, mouth shut. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at Reed's hands, measuring the distance from his fingers to the gun on his hip, calculating how fast he'd draw. Her name was Sutton, 27 years old, thin enough that her collarbones jutted out like folded knife blades beneath skin the color of old paper. Dark brown hair cut unevenly with a blade. A faded scar running along her jawline, but her amber eyes were sharp, the kind of sharp that belongs to someone who'd stopped fearing death and was only counting how many hours she had left. Reed Ashford, East Coast Syndicate boss, 33. A faded scar trailing from his temple to his cheekbone. Steel gray eyes colder than the rain outside, had ordered men killed without blinking. But that night, he pulled off his coat, threw it over a stranger's shoulders, and said, "Get in the car or freeze to death out here. I don't care." But the cars got heat. He wanted a quiet night. What he got was a shattered heart, and the iron rust smell of dried blood clinging to her fingers as she climbed into his car without saying a word. If this story hit you where it counts, smash that like button to support the channel, share it with anyone who loves raw, emotional mafia storytelling, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The Maybach slid through the curtain of rain like a silent black beast. Tate kept both hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed to the road, but every few seconds he glanced into the rearview mirror. Reed sat in the back seat on the right, his spine resting against the cold leather, his eyes facing forward without truly seeing anything at all. Beside him on the left, Sutton had pulled her bare feet up onto the seat, both knees pressed tight to her chest. Reed's long coat draped from her shoulders to past her knees like a tent thrown over a breathing skeleton. She didn't look at him. She looked out through the window, her amber eyes sliding over every street lamp, every turn, every road sign blurred by the rain. Reed knew what she was doing. She was counting, remembering, drawing an escape map in her head. Because 7 years of living in another person's hands had taught her that every door could slam shut at any moment, and the only way to survive was to know the way out before you needed to run. He didn't stop her. The car intercom clicked softly. Tate's voice came through low and controlled. The other 3 girls reached the shelter. They're safe. A beat of silence. Then Tate continued, more slowly, as if weighing each word. This one's file has a private note from the Voss line. It says dangerous, attacked clients, escaped 3 times. The shelter refused to take her. Reed turned the silver ring on his ring finger. Once. Twice. He didn't look at Sutton. He looked at the streaks of rain sliding down the car window, as if the answer were somewhere between those racing drops. Take her home. 2 words. No explanation. Tate didn't ask again. His jaw tightened once, just enough for Reed to see it in the rearview mirror, but his hand stayed steady on the wheel, and the Maybach turned north, onto the steep coastal road known only by 2 kinds of people, those who belonged to Reed Ashford, and those who were about to die by his hand. The mansion emerged through the rain like a gray stone mass growing out of the cliff, silently watching the Black Sea below. From the outside, it looked like an abandoned museum. Inside, it held a safe room built from bomb-resistant steel, a room Reed had never needed to use, and even now he still didn't think he would need. The front door opened before Tate had time to cut the engine. Mrs. Brogan stood on the threshold, her small frame wrapped in a gray sweater, her silver hair coiled neatly at the back of her neck, her green eyes sharp as dressmaker's shears. She looked at Sutton for exactly 1 second only, long enough to see the bare feet, the collarbones jutting beneath the oversized coat, and the amber eyes sweeping over her from head to toe with the speed of someone used to judging threats before judging kindness. Mrs. Brogan didn't ask. She only said, her voice as even as if she were reading the breakfast menu, "The East Room is ready. I left clean towels on the bed." Then she turned to Reed, and her eyes changed, sharper now, heavier, The kind of look only the woman who had fed him for 10 years would dare to use on him. "Do you know what you're doing?" Reed didn't answer. He stepped past her and held the door open for Sutton to enter. Sutton stopped at the threshold for one beat. Not hesitation. She was measuring. The width of the doorway, the distance to the hallway, the number of steps to the nearest back door. Then she stepped inside. The living room had a high ceiling, an unlit marble fireplace, and dark oak floors that reflected her shape back like an ink stain spreading across wood. Reed's coat hung over her like a tent pitched on a frame of bone, and in the dim yellow light of a room too large for one person and too cold for anyone, Sutton Graves looked like a ghost who had just been invited inside, while no one yet knew what to do with her. Reed led her down the second-floor hallway, his steps heavy on the wooden floor, while hers made no sound at all. He stopped before a dark oak door, pushed it open, and turned on the light. A private guest room overlooked the sea, with a single bed made in white sheets and clean towels folded neatly on the pillow, exactly as Mrs. Brogan had said. He turned to her, his voice brief, like an order given in a boardroom. "Your room." Sutton looked into the room, looked at the bed, looked at the window, then she turned her back and walked straight down the hallway, past the second door, past the third door, until she stopped in front of the heaviest double doors at the end of the hall, the doors that anyone who had lived long enough inside the house of a powerful man would know belonged to the master bedroom. She pushed the door open and went in. Reed stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, watching her step into his bedroom as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He followed her, stopped at the threshold, and saw that she was already standing beside the bed. Her back was straight. Her eyes were fixed on the opposite wall, not looking at him, not looking at anything at all. Both of her hands rose to her chest and began undoing the buttons of the coat he had thrown over her shoulders in the warehouse, one button at a time. Her fingers didn't tremble. The movement was even mechanical, precise, like someone who had repeated this act hundreds of times until it no longer needed thought. The first button, the second button, her eyes still on the wall, her face empty, not surrender, not fear, absence. Sutton Graves had left her body before her fingers ever touched the first button. What remained beside Reed's bed was only a machine made of bone and skin, carrying out a procedure. Step 1. Enter the new man's house. Step 2. Find the master bedroom. Step 3. Prepare. 7 years. 7 years had turned a human being into this. Reed Ashford had looked at dead men without blinking. He had sat across from people begging, people cursing, people crying until there were no tears left, only a dry, scraping sound rising from the bottom of the throat. None of that had prepared him for this. It wasn't violence that destroyed him. It was how ordinary she made it. The way she unbuttoned the coat with hands as calm as someone hanging up a jacket after coming home from work. The way she stood there, her body present while her soul had left the room long ago, leaving behind a hollow shell that knew how to move and knew how to obey. That destroyed him more brutally than any bullet that had ever grazed his temple. He stepped into the room. 2 long strides. His hand stopped hers at the third button. He didn't grip her. He only placed his hand there, lightly, just enough to make her stop. Sutton didn't flinch. She simply stopped. Her amber eyes stayed fixed on the wall, waiting, like a machine paused in the middle of its cycle, ready to start again the moment someone pressed the button. Reed bent down, picked up the coat as it sagged from her shoulders, pulled it back into place, fastened the second button, then the first. His fingers were large, rough, more used to holding a gun than handling a needle, awkward with each small button. He settled the coat over her shoulders again, pulled the collar high to cover the pale skin at her throat, and said the only 2 words his throat would release. "Wrong room." Sutton blinked. For the first time since she had entered that room, one small, quick blink, like a crack running across glass. She turned her head and looked at him. Not into his eyes. She looked at his mouth, reading those 2 words again on his lips, as if she didn't trust her own ears. Reed placed a hand on her back, gently, not pushing, only guiding. He led her out of his bedroom, along the hallway, back to the dark oak door she had walked past without even looking. He opened the door, turned on the light, pointed to the brass key lying on the bedside table. "This room locks, from the inside. Use it." He didn't wait for her to answer. He closed the door, turned his back, and went down the stairs. Each step creaked beneath his weight, as if the house were groaning for the things he wouldn't allow himself to say. He entered the study downstairs. Didn't turn on the light. Didn't pour a drink. He sat in the leather chair behind the desk, both hands gripping the arms of the chair, and squeezed. Squeezed until his knuckles turned white, until the leather cracked under his nails, until the nausea settled enough for him to breathe without thinking about the way she had undone those buttons with dead hands. In the dark, he sat there, the East Coast Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything from the ports to the courtrooms, and for the first time in his life he felt completely powerless. Not before an enemy, not before guns, but before a 27-year-old girl, whom the world had taught that her body was the only currency she had, and she had just placed it on the table in front of him as payment for her first night's room. Reed didn't sleep. He sat in the dark study, didn't turn on the lights, didn't pour another drink, only sat there with the darkness and the sound of the sea wind howling beyond the bulletproof glass. About 1 hour after he had closed the bedroom door for Sutton, he pulled the security monitor on the desk toward him and turned on the second-floor hallway camera. Not the camera inside her room. He didn't install cameras inside guest bedrooms. Never had. And that was one of the few boundaries he still kept in a life that had erased almost every boundary. But there were hallway cameras, and on the gray-green infrared screen, he saw her. Sutton hadn't gone into the room. She was sitting on the wooden floor right outside the bedroom door, her back against the wall, both knees pulled to her chest, her eyes open. Not the eyes of someone who couldn't sleep, the eyes of someone keeping watch. She stared down the hallway toward the stairs, tracking every shadow, every shift of light, every creak of the old house breathing in the night. She was guarding her own door, because 7 years had taught her that a closed door didn't mean safety, that a lock could be broken, that the darkness behind a shut door was often more dangerous than the darkness of an open hallway. At least out here, she could see what was coming. Reed watched her sit there for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minutes. She didn't move, didn't let her head fall, didn't close her eyes for even 1 second. Her back was rigid against the wall, as if that spine had forgotten how to bend, forgotten how to let go, forgotten how to allow gravity to pull the body into the rest every ordinary human being needed in order to survive. Nearly 2 hours later, she began to tilt. Not because she chose to. Her body surrendered before her will allowed it. Her shoulders slid along the wall. Her head dipped. She startled awake, lifted her face, swept the hallway with her eyes, then slowly stood, opened the bedroom door, and stepped inside. Reed waited. He waited to see the light in her room turn on through the crack of the door on the camera. The light didn't turn on. She entered the room in complete darkness, and in the corner of the hallway camera, he saw one final moment before the door closed, the infrared light reaching far enough for him to see that she didn't climb into the bed. She crawled under it, curled herself on the cold wooden floor, pulled the blanket down from the bed to cover herself completely, and lay there, inside the cramped darkness between the bed frame and the floor, like a wild animal finding the narrowest den possible so it could press its back against stone and sleep, because a narrow den meant no one could come from behind. Reed turned off the monitor. The study sank into solid black. He sat in the dark, turning the silver ring on his ring finger, one circle after another, steady, mechanical, exactly the way she had unbuttoned the coat earlier, and he realized with bitterness rising into his throat that both of them had their own rituals for surviving unbearable things. She crawled under beds. He turned a ring in the dark, and both of them called it normal. Morning came later than Reed expected. Or maybe he had sat in the dark longer than he realized. Silver-gray light seeped through the curtains of the study, that cold season coastal light, wet and chilled, and promising nothing good. He stood, his spine cracking, his neck stiff from dozing in the chair, and went down to the kitchen. The smell of coffee. Someone had made coffee. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. Sutton was standing there, her back pressed against the stainless steel refrigerator, both shoulders slightly raised. Her weight shifted to the left, the same tilt he had noticed in the warehouse the night before, the mark of someone used to being hit from the right and always ready to dodge. She was wearing one of his old sweaters, which Mrs. Brogan must have left in the room, oversized on her thin frame, the sleeves falling past her fingers. She looked smaller than she had the night before, if that was even possible. But it wasn't the sweater, or the folded-in posture, that made Reed stop. It was her right hand. Her arm hung at her side, turned slightly behind her, and Reed, a man who had lived 33 years among guns and knives and hands hiding weapons, saw it immediately. The muscles in her forearm were tight. Her weight shifted a few degrees farther, and behind her back, Hidden between her body and the cold steel face of the refrigerator was the butcher knife, held in reverse, the blade pressed along her forearm, the handle fitted neatly into her palm. She wasn't pointing it at anyone, wasn't raising it as a threat. She held it the way someone holds a talisman, the one thing between her and the rest of a world she believed would always want to hurt her. 7 years. For 7 years, she had only been able to sleep with something sharp in her hand. A shard of glass, a nail, a rusted strip of metal broken from a bed frame, anything she could grip in the night and tell herself she wasn't completely helpless, that she still had one choice left, that if the door opened in the dark, at least she would have something in her hand besides fear. And now, in the industrial stainless steel kitchen of a mafia boss's mansion, she stood with a butcher knife hidden behind her back, and her amber eyes locked on Reed Ashford, measuring every movement he made, reading every breath he took, waiting to see what the first morning in a new man's house would bring. Because morning was always the most dangerous time. Morning was when men sobered up, woke up, outgrew the generosity of the night, and remembered they had paid for something they hadn't yet received. Reed didn't look at the knife. He looked at the coffee pot on the stove, stepped past her with enough distance that she didn't need to press her back any harder against the refrigerator, and walked straight to the kitchen table on the opposite side. He pulled out a chair, the steel legs scraping across the stone floor in the silent kitchen, and sat down, with his back to her, completely, not turning halfway, not angling a shoulder, not looking back over his head. He truly turned his back, exposing the back of his neck, his spine, the broad blades of his shoulders with nothing protecting them except the wrinkled fabric of the shirt he had slept in after collapsing in a chair all night. He left every weak point on his body open to a girl holding a butcher knife less than 4 steps behind him. He poured coffee into the white ceramic mug on the table, took one sip, set the mug down, and said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep, calm as if he were talking about the weather, his eyes on the glass doors ahead without turning around. A butcher knife isn't good for defense. The handle's slippery, easy to lose when your hands sweat. 3rd drawer on the left has a folding knife, steel blade, rubber grip. Take that one. He took another sip of coffee. Didn't turn around. Didn't explain further. He didn't say, put the knife down. He didn't say, you don't need a knife here. He didn't say any of the sentences she had heard men say before they ripped a weapon from her hand and used that same weapon to teach her a lesson about obedience. He only said the knife she was holding wasn't good enough, and showed her where to find a better one. Behind his back, silence stretched, not the kind of fearful silence he had grown used to hearing since last night. It was a confused silence, the silence of someone who had just stepped into a room where every piece of furniture stood in the wrong place compared to the map inside her head. Then he heard it, metal touching steel, lightly. The butcher knife had been set down on the kitchen counter behind him. A pause, the sound of a drawer opening. Not the 1st drawer, not the 2nd drawer, the 3rd drawer on the left, wood sliding on its track, small pieces of metal knocking softly together as fingers searched. Then the drawer closed. Reed drank his coffee, eyes on the gray sea beyond the glass, and listened to her footsteps leaving the kitchen. Lighter than when she had entered. Not lighter from fear. Lighter because for the first time in this house, her feet didn't need to land hard enough to be ready to turn and run. That afternoon, Mrs. Brogan walked down the 2nd floor hallway with a wooden tray in both hands. She didn't knock on Sutton's door. She set the tray gently on the floor in front of it, then straightened her back and walked away without a word. On the tray was a bowl of hot chicken soup, a small loaf of bread, a glass of water, and beside the tray, a cloth bag holding dark blue jeans, a gray sweater, and a pair of white sneakers. Mrs. Brogan didn't know Sutton's shoe size, but Mrs. Brogan had cared for enough people in her life to know how to look at a pair of bare feet, walking across a cold wooden floor, and estimate down to half a size. No one knocked, no one called, no one forced. 1 hour later, when Mrs. Brogan came back, the soup tray was empty. The bowl was clean, the bread was gone. The glass had been turned upside down on the tray, arranged neatly in the manner of someone used to cleaning up after herself, so she wouldn't give anyone a reason to complain. Beside the tray, the old clothes Sutton had been wearing when she arrived, the torn shirt and thin fabric pants, had been folded squarely into a small, careful stack. The shoes had disappeared into the room. Mrs. Brogan picked up the tray, looked at the folded stack of old clothes. And for the first time in many years of serving in this house, her eyes softened for 1 second before returning to their usual sharpness. She carried the tray down to the kitchen and said nothing to Reed. She didn't need to. That night, after Tate checked the outer security and locked the main gate, Reed went upstairs alone. In his suit pocket, he carried a new lock set, an industrial steel bolt, the kind even a master key couldn't open, the kind he used for the safe room in the basement, not for a guest bedroom. He knelt in front of Sutton's door, removed the old lock, and installed the new one. He worked slowly, carefully, trying not to make noise, but in a house as silent as a tomb at night, every turn of the screwdriver was clear. He knew she could hear it. He knew she was lying under the bed on the other side of the door, eyes open, hand gripping the new folding knife, listening to every scrape of metal against wood. He didn't explain. When he was done, he stood, slipped the screwdriver into his pocket, and spoke to the closed door, just loud enough to pass through the oak. New lock, steel bolt. No one can open it from the outside. Then he went down the stairs, his footsteps heavy, his back slightly bent with exhaustion, and he didn't look back. In the following days, Reed watched on the cameras as she searched the whole house. Not secretly. She moved in broad daylight, while Reed was in the study and Tate was outside, going from room to room, opening every drawer, checking every cabinet, noting every window, every doorway, every exit route. She found the second kitchen knife in the secondary kitchen drawer. She found the pistol in the nightstand drawer of Reed's master bedroom. She found the spare car keys in the wooden box on the living room shelf. She found the back door leading into the garden, and from the garden, the cliffside path down to the beach. She was drawing a map. Not on paper. In her head. 7 years had taught her that paper could be found, but no one could confiscate the map inside her mind. Reed watched all of it on camera. He saw her open his nightstand drawer, look at the pistol, then close it. He saw her stand at the back door for 15 seconds, measuring the distance to the fence, then turn back inside. He saw everything, and he didn't lock a single drawer, didn't hide the gun, didn't move the car keys, didn't block the back door, because Reed Ashford understood something most men never understand, that you can't make someone feel safe by stripping away every choice they have. She needed to know she could leave at any time. She needed to know where the gun was, where the knives were, where the keys were. She needed that map not so she could run, but so every night, when she lay under the bed in the darkness, she could tell herself she was here because she had chosen to stay, not because she was locked in. And whether the day would ever come when she no longer needed that map, the day she lay on the bed instead of under it, Reed didn't know. He only knew he wouldn't be the one to shorten the road by locking the doors. The first week passed in a repeating rhythm, like the ticking of a clock inside a house too large for two people who didn't know how to speak to each other. Every morning, Reed went down to the kitchen, poured coffee, set a plate of food on the table, then walked out without looking back, cares on this. Every morning, Sutton stood in the same place, her back against the stainless steel refrigerator, her amber eyes fixed on the kitchen door, the folding knife tucked inside the pocket of the jeans missus. Brogan had left outside her room on the first day. She didn't sit down. She ate standing, quickly, without lifting her head, the way someone eats after learning that a plate can be snatched away at any moment, after learning that slow chewing is a luxury, that every second her mouth stops moving is one more second in which food can be taken from her. Reed didn't watch her eat. He knew that if he watched, she would stop. Every day, he returned to the kitchen after about 1 hour, and every day the plate was clean. The bowl had been washed and turned upside down on the rack, the chopsticks and spoons lined up straight as rulers. She erased every trace of herself from the kitchen, as if her existence were something that had to be wiped away before someone noticed and became displeased. On the 5th day, she ate more slowly. Reed knew because the plate began taking longer to empty. On the 8th day, he went down to the kitchen for afternoon coffee and saw her standing by the sink, holding a glass of water in both hands, drinking slowly, her eyes looking out at the sea beyond the glass doors. It was the first time he had seen her look through a window without counting distances. She simply looked, at the waves, at the gray sky. She looked like someone who had forgotten how to look at something without calculating an escape route. On the 12th day, she sat down, not at the dining table in the large dining room Reed never used. She sat on the steel stool in the kitchen, beside the industrial work table, her back still toward the refrigerator, her face still toward the door, but sitting, both feet on the floor, both knees not drawn up to her chest. That was all. But for someone who had eaten standing up for 11 straight days because she didn't believe she was allowed to sit in another person's house, it was an entire revolution carried out in silence. Reed said nothing. That afternoon, he went down to the kitchen, pulled the second steel stool out from the corner, and placed it beside the kitchen table, across from where she sat. He sat there and drank his coffee, instead of taking it to the study. Didn't look at her. Didn't speak to her. Only sat. 2 stools. 1 steel kitchen table. 2 cups of coffee. An arm's length apart. That was all that changed in the second week. And it was more than Reed Ashford knew how to give. The third week began with the sound of a fall. A heavy thud came from the back kitchen stairs. The kind of sound human bones make when they strike hard wood. Reed was in the downstairs study, and when he heard it, he shot to his feet. Tate was outside checking the security fence, at least 2 minutes away at a run. But when Reed reached the foot of the kitchen stairs, Sutton was already there. She had run from the kitchen faster than he had from the study. Mrs. Brogan was lying on the floor at the bottom step. Her face tightened with pain, both hands clutching her right knee. One fuzzy slipper slipped from her foot and rolled down to the lower stair. Sutton knelt beside her. No panic, no shouting for help. Her hands settled on Mrs. Brogan's knee, her fingers moving slowly and firmly, pressing lightly along the kneecap, checking whether the bone had shifted, whether the joint had dislocated. With the strange precision of someone who had never trained in medicine, but had taught herself to feel bones on her own body enough times to know how an unbroken bone and a broken one felt beneath her fingertips. "Not broken," Sutton said, her voice low and quick. "Bad bruise. Possible hairline fracture. Ice for 20 minutes. Rest. Elevate the leg." She stood, went into the kitchen, and returned with a bag of ice wrapped in a towel in less than 1 minute. She placed the ice on Mrs. Brogan's knee gently, then stepped back. Reed stood at the foot of the stairs, watching everything. He didn't interrupt. He watched her hands move over Mrs. Brogan's knee and realized those hands didn't only know how to hold a knife. Those hands knew how to find broken bone under skin, knew how to tell the difference between an ordinary bruise and a dangerous one, knew how many minutes of ice were enough. And she had learned all of that, not from medical school, but from her own body, from nights spent feeling her own ribs after being beaten to see whether she needed to splint herself, from times when she pressed her fingers into her own face in the dark to guess how long the bruise would take to change color. Mrs. Brogan looked up at the girl kneeling beside her. She didn't say thank you right away. She looked at those amber eyes avoiding hers, looked at the way Sutton moved back after placing the ice as if she was afraid that staying too close for too long might become a nuisance. And then she reached out one wrinkled hand and took Sutton's hand, held it tight. "Thank you, darling." 3 words. Her voice was warm and full. The voice of an Irish woman who had lived long enough to know when a child needed to hear someone call her darling, even if that child was 27 years old and carried a folding knife in her pocket. Sutton pulled her hand back. Fast, as if burned. She stood, stepped back again, eyes lowered to the floor, then turned and walked into the kitchen without saying another word. But Reed, still standing at the foot of the stairs, saw her fingers close into a fist after she pulled away from Mrs. Brogan's hand, closed tight, as if she were trying to keep the feeling of someone holding her hand without wanting anything from her, trying to hold on to it because she didn't know when she would ever feel it again. That night, for the first time since she had entered this house, Sutton didn't lock her bedroom door. Reed knew because he didn't hear the familiar click at 10 o'clock, that tiny sound that had become the house's biological clock. The click meaning she had gone into her room, the click meaning she was still alive, the click meaning one more day had passed and she was still here. That night, there was no click, and Reed lay on the study sofa, staring at the ceiling, not knowing why the absence of such a small sound made his chest feel lighter, as if someone had lifted a stone from his ribs. The 4th week broke the quiet rhythm with something Reed didn't see in person, but watched back on camera with his jaw clenched so tightly Tate thought he might crack his molars. A new bodyguard, a man Tate had hired 2 weeks earlier to reinforce the night patrol. A large, stupid man who hadn't been told about the girl living on the 2nd floor. He blocked Sutton in the 1st floor hallway while she was walking from the kitchen back to her room, a glass of water in her hand. He said something. He pushed her into the wall. The glass fell and shattered on the wooden floor. The camera had no sound, only images. But Reed didn't need sound to read the man's mouth, to see the way he leaned toward her, the way his arm barred her in and pinned her against the wall. The way he smiled, a smile Reed had seen on too many faces, not to know exactly what it meant. But the thing that made Reed stare at the screen wasn't the bodyguard. It was Sutton. She didn't scream, didn't call for help, didn't panic. On camera, he watched her stand against the wall, eyes fixed on the man's face, and her right hand moved, slow, steady, precise as a machine, pulling the folding knife from her pocket, snapping the steel blade open with a flick of her thumb, and placing the blade against the inside of the man's thigh. The man froze. On camera, Reed saw her lips move. She said something short. Tate told him later, because Tate had watched the hallway footage with audio. Femoral artery, 90 seconds. 4 words, her voice flat as a steel tabletop. No threat, no anger, only a medical fact presented by someone who knew exactly where the femoral artery was and how long 90 seconds lasted, because she had lived long enough in the dark to know where the human body breaks fastest. The man stepped back. Sutton folded the knife, picked up the broken pieces of glass, and continued up the stairs. Her back straight, her steps even, as if nothing had just happened, as if she had merely brushed a fly from her shoulder, rather than placed a blade against the thigh of a man twice her size. She told no one, mentioned nothing, didn't find Reed to report it. In her world, this wasn't an event. It was Tuesday. Tate watched the camera, informed Reed, and handled the bodyguard within 1 hour. Reed didn't ask Tate how he handled it. He didn't need the details. He only needed to know that the man would never open his mouth about anything inside these walls, and Tate guaranteed that in the way only Tate knew how to guarantee. But that night, Reed didn't sleep, not because of what had happened, because of the way Sutton had handled it. That calm, that precision, the way she knew exactly where to put the blade, what to say, and what voice to use. She hadn't learned that from books. She had learned it from nights when she had to save herself, because no one came to save her. She had learned it from times when her body was the battlefield, and she was the only soldier. And that familiarity with violence so deep it had become a life skill, left Reed Ashford, the man who had built an empire on violence, lying on the study sofa, staring at the ceiling, feeling his throat tighten around something he had no name for. Sutton began cooking in the middle of the 4th week, not because anyone told her to cook, not because she was paying back food and shelter, and not because she was trying to prove she was useful. She cooked because the 40-square-meter industrial stainless steel kitchen in the Ashford mansion was the only place in the world where she felt she could control something. In the kitchen, fire burned when she turned it on. Water boiled when she wanted it to. Salt was as salty as the amount she added. Meat cooked to the exact degree she chose. No one grabbed her hand. No one turned off the stove halfway through. No one kicked a pot onto the floor because she looked in the wrong direction. In the kitchen, Sutton Graves was the one who decided. And that feeling, that ordinary little feeling so small that anyone else would never even think about it, was larger to her than this entire house. She started with simple things. Beef stew with potatoes, pasta with tomato sauce, then more complicated things. Bread she kneaded herself, proofed herself, and baked herself in the industrial oven she took 2 days to figure out how to adjust. The smell of baking bread spread through the entire first floor in the morning. A warm, thick smell the gray stone house had never had before, and Mrs. Brogan stood at the kitchen door, drew in one long breath, then turned away without saying anything. But that afternoon, a hardcover cookbook appeared on the kitchen table. Old, its spine worn, many pages stained with butter and flour from decades earlier. No giver's name, no note, only the book lying there as if it had always belonged there. Sutton looked at the book. She didn't pick it up right away. She looked at it all afternoon, glancing over every time she passed, as if she were waiting to see whether it would disappear, whether someone would come back and snatch it away, whether someone was using it to test her, to see whether she would dare take something that hadn't been clearly given to her in words. The book was still there when night came. The next morning, it was on the kitchen shelf beside the salt jar, and Sutton was cooking beef bourguignon from page 123. Reed ate dinner in the kitchen that night, sitting on the second stool, not saying the food was good, not praising it, not commenting. He only finished the whole plate, placed it in the sink, and poured more coffee for both of them. That was the longest conversation between the two of them that week, and it didn't contain a single word. Then that night came. The night everything changed. Not with gunfire or shouting, but but with a nearly empty bottle of bourbon and an old photograph. 2 o'clock in the morning. Reed sat in the dark kitchen. He hadn't turned on the main light. There was only the dim blue glow from the LED strip beneath the range hood, a weak light that turned everything in the kitchen into blurred silver-gray outlines. The bottle of Blanton's bourbon on the table was more than half empty. The heavy glass in his hand was dark amber, and on the steel tabletop, beside the bottle, lay a photograph. Small, old, its edges curled with time. In the photograph was a young man, probably around 30 years old, standing in front of a small house in some suburb, somewhere before the gray stone mansion on the cliff, before the empire, before the blood. The man in the photograph was smiling, a wide, real smile, the kind of smile Reed didn't remember ever seeing on his father's face outside this photograph, because in his memory his father didn't smile. His father spoke seriously at the dinner table, and walked into his uncle's study, and never came out again. Reed looked at the photograph, drank bourbon. Looked at the photograph, drank bourbon, again and again, like a machine, because today was the anniversary of his father's death. And every year on this day, he took the photograph out, sat in the dark, and drank until the smiling face in the picture blurred enough for him to put it back in the drawer and pretend he was fine for another 364 days. He didn't hear her footsteps. Sutton moved without sound. 7 years had taught her how to walk without letting the floor betray where she was. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her shoulder resting against the frame, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him, watching the bourbon bottle, watching the photograph on the table, watching his blue-gray eyes, wetter than usual beneath the dim blue LED light, and she understood. She understood not because he said anything. She understood because she knew what darkness looked like when someone sat alone inside it at 2 o'clock in the morning with the only thing left of a person they had lost. "Nightmare?" she asked from the doorway. Her voice was quiet, not the flat voice she had used when she held a knife to the bodyguard's thigh. Softer, careful, like someone stepping onto a frozen lake without knowing whether the ice was thick or thin. Reed didn't look up. "I don't dream." Silence. The bourbon bottle touched the steel table with a soft sound as he poured more. Then he said, his voice low, broken at the edges like cracked glass, "Today is the day my father died." He said nothing else, didn't explain how his father died, didn't say how old he had been, didn't say how many nights over all these years he had sat exactly like this, with this exact bottle of bourbon, this exact photograph. He only said those 8 words and stopped, as if 8 words were already too much for a man who had built an empire by never letting anyone see him bleed. Sutton didn't say, "I'm sorry." She had heard that sentence enough in her life to know how empty it could be when it came from the mouth of someone who couldn't change anything. She didn't ask more, didn't comfort him, didn't touch him. She stepped into the kitchen, her footsteps still making no sound, sat down on the floor beside his chair, leaned her back against the leg of the steel kitchen table, and drew her knees up. Then she reached out, took the bourbon bottle, and poured some into the white ceramic mug she used for coffee every morning. She took a sip, grimaced. Blanton's bourbon wasn't easy to drink for someone who wasn't used to it. But she took a second sip, then a third, and sat there. 2 people in the dark kitchen, the blue LED light tracing faint outlines across their faces. 1 person in a chair, 1 person on the floor, the bourbon bottle passing between 2 hands without needing questions. Without needing permission. Silence stretched. Not the suffocating silence of the first night. Not the defensive silence of the first week. But the rare kind of silence 2 people only find when both are too tired to keep the walls up. Too tired to pretend. Too tired to do anything but sit there and breathe together in the dark, and allow that to be enough. 4 o'clock in the morning. Light began to seep through the kitchen glass. Silver gray, wet. The bourbon bottle was almost empty. Sutton set her mug on the floor. She stood slowly, her joints cracking from sitting so long on the cold floor, and walked toward the kitchen door. Before stepping out, she stopped, didn't turn her head, spoke into the empty space in front of her. "I don't dream either. I'm just not used to quiet places. Quiet is louder than screaming." Then she went upstairs, her steps still soundless. Reed sat in the kitchen, looking at the photograph of his father, looking at the white ceramic mug she had left on the floor with a trace of bourbon still on the rim, and realized that for the first time in all the hours of the day he hated most each year, he didn't feel completely alone. Not because she had said anything profound, not because she had comforted him, but because she simply sat down beside him in the dark, with her own pain, and didn't demand that he explain anything. For the first time, he wasn't the stronger person in the room. For the first time, she wasn't the person who needed to be rescued. They were only two people broken by the world in two different ways, sitting beside each other in the kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning, drinking bourbon and saying nothing. And somehow, that was enough. That night, as Reed lay on the study sofa in the familiar darkness, he listened. 10 o'clock, 10:15, 10:30. The sound of Sutton's bedroom lock never came. She didn't lock the door. The 5th week began with the sound of the front door slamming shut at 3 o'clock in the morning. Not an ordinary closing sound. The sound of someone pushing it with his shoulder, because both hands were occupied. Sutton heard it from her room on the 2nd floor. She no longer slept under the bed. For 4 nights now, she had slept on the bed, though still close to the edge, feet pointed toward the door, the folding knife beneath her pillow. She heard heavy footsteps on the 1st floor, heard Tate saying something over the phone, his voice low and urgent, then heard the kitchen chair scrape across the stone floor. She lay still, listening, sorting the sounds by priority the way she had done every night for 7 years. Not a break-in, not a fight. The sound of someone coming home with his body no longer whole. She went down the stairs, didn't turn on the hallway light, made no sound with her steps, stopped in the kitchen doorway. Reed was sitting on the familiar steel stool, his stool, beside the industrial kitchen table. His black suit jacket was thrown over the back of the chair, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, and his left hand was wrapped in a cloth handkerchief already soaked dark red. Blood seeped between his fingers and dripped onto the steel tabletop, each drop making a small, steady ticking sound in the silent kitchen, like a clock counting down. Tate stood by the sink, his phone pinned between his shoulder and ear, calling the private doctor. Tate's eyes caught Sutton in the doorway, one eyebrow lifting and then lowering again. But he said nothing, only turned away and continued speaking into the phone. Reed didn't look up. He sat there, his right hand turning the silver ring, his left hand bleeding on the table, his face calm as if he were waiting for morning coffee. He was used to it, used to being wounded, used to sitting and waiting for someone to come patch him back together, used to his own blood on tables, on car floors, on the sleeves of white shirts. 33 years in this world had taught him that pain was only a signal, and a signal could be turned off if he was patient enough to wait. Sutton looked at the blood. She didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask who had cut him, didn't ask whether they needed to call the police, because she had lived in this world long enough to know the police didn't exist here. She looked at the blood leaking through the cloth, judged the speed of the bleeding, the amount already lost, and stepped into the kitchen, not slowly, not cautiously, straight and steady, past Tate, to the table. She pulled out the 2nd steel stool, her stool, sat down across from Reed, and did something she had never done since stepping into this house. She reached out, took his left wrist, and pulled his hand toward her. No permission, no looking into his eyes to wait for approval. No asking, "Can I?" She simply took his wrist and pulled, gently but firmly. The way someone takes hold of something she has decided is her responsibility in that moment. Reed looked up, for the first time since she had entered the kitchen. His blue-gray eyes met her amber ones, and there he saw something he had never seen before. Not fear, not defense, not the calmness of a machine with its feelings shut off. Focus. The focus of someone doing something she knew how to do, something she knew she did well. And in that moment, she wasn't a victim, wasn't the person being rescued, wasn't the barefoot girl in the warehouse. She was the one holding his hand, and he was the one bleeding. She unwrapped the handkerchief from his left hand, slowly. The cloth stuck to the skin, because the blood had already begun to clot. She soaked the cloth with warm water from the kettle on the kitchen table, waited for the fabric to soften, then peeled it back layer by layer. The wound showed under the dim blue LED light, a cut along the palm, deep enough to show the fat beneath the skin, but not deep enough to reach the tendon. It didn't need a doctor. It needed needle and thread. Sutton stood, went to the drawer beside the oven, where Mrs. Brogan kept the sewing box. She had known where that box was since the first week, when she had searched the whole house and drawn the map in her head. She brought the box back to the table, opened it, took out a spool of black thread and the smallest sewing needle. She washed her hands with salt water from the jar on the spice rack, washed the needle, washed the wound one more time. Reed sat still and watched her prepare. Tate was still on the phone by the sink, but he had stopped completely and turned to look. The phone still against his ear, but his mouth no longer speaking. His eyes wider than usual as he watched Sutton thread the needle with hands that were entirely still. She began to stitch. The first stitch. The needle pierced skin, the thread pulled through, and the two edges of the cut came together. Reed clenched his teeth but didn't pull his hand away. The second stitch. More even. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, thumb and forefinger working together as if she had done this many times. Too many times. Enough that it had become muscle memory and no longer needed conscious thought. The third stitch. The fourth. The fifth. 5 perfectly even stitches across his palm, the spacing between them identical. The thread tight enough to close the skin, not so tight that it pulled, not so loose that the edges opened. More professional than many of the doctors Tate was trying to reach by phone. She cut the thread. Washed the stitches again with salt water. Took gauze from the first aid kit in the kitchen cabinet, and wrapped his hand. Neat. Firm enough. When she finished, she set his hand down gently on the table and sat back on her stool, both hands resting on her lap, eyes lowered to the blood still staining her fingers. "Where did you learn?" Reed asked. His voice was rougher than usual, not from pain. "On myself," she answered without looking up. 2 words. And inside those 2 words were 7 years of stitching cuts on her own arms in the dark, splinting broken fingers with popsicle sticks and tape, pressing gauze to wounds on her thigh until the blood stopped because no one else would do it for her. Because in the world she had lived in, the wounded either licked their own wounds or died. There was no third choice. Reed looked at her, looked at the small hands stained with his blood in her lap, looked at the way she sat straight on the steel stool, not folded in on herself, not shifting her weight to the left as she always did. Because in the moment she stitched his hand, she didn't need to defend herself. For the first time in this house, she had touched him. And she had chosen to touch him when he was at his weakest. Not when he wore a 3-piece suit and gave orders in a boardroom. Not when he held a gun or turned his silver ring with a face colder than steel. But when he sat in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, his shirt stained with blood, his hands shaking from blood loss, his power pared down to flesh and skin and bone and pain. She chose that moment to touch him. And the way she touched him wasn't submission, wasn't service, wasn't repayment. She touched him the way a carpenter touches wood, the way a healer touches a wound. With skill, with certainty, with the one thing 7 years hadn't taken from her, the ability to keep something broken from breaking worse. Tate ended the call, looked at the 2 of them, looked at the stitches in Reed's hand, looked at the open sewing box on the table, and quietly stepped out of the kitchen without saying a word, closing the kitchen door behind him, like a man who understood that he had just witnessed something he shouldn't stay to watch any further. Reed stood up. His newly stitched left hand was numb, his fingers stiff, every movement sending a sharp pull along his arm. He walked to the gas stove, took the coffee pot still warm from the afternoon that Mrs. Brogan hadn't had time to empty, and poured into 2 mugs with one hand, his right hand. Some coffee spilled because he wasn't used to using only one hand. He placed one mug in front of Sutton, the other in front of himself, and sat down again. Not bourbon in the darkness at 2 o'clock in the morning on the anniversary of his father's death. Coffee. 4 o'clock in the morning. His blood on her fingers, her thread in his skin. 2 people sitting across from each other in the stainless steel kitchen, drinking coffee that was still warm. And for the first time since Sutton stepped into the Maybach on that rainy night, the space between the 2 stools no longer felt like an ocean. Garrett Hale arrived unannounced on a Thursday evening in a black Escalade, wearing a light gray suit, expensive cologne, and a porcelain veneered smile that had never once truly smiled. He was the boss of the Western organization, Reed's partner in a territorial division agreement worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Reed received Hale in the main dining room, with its long oak table, crystal chandelier, and heavy velvet curtains. Tate stood behind the wall, his hand ready on his holster. Sutton was in the kitchen, unaware there was a guest. The negotiation went smoothly for 40 minutes. Then Sutton passed the doorway of the secondary dining room, carrying a kettle of hot water to prepare coffee for the guest, just as Mrs. Brogan had told her to do. She only passed by, but Hale saw her. His eyes narrowed, searching through memory, and finding what they were looking for. Voss's girl. He turned back to Reed and smiled. I remember this face, very obedient. Reed didn't react right away. That was the most dangerous thing. He set the dinner knife down on the table, so lightly that the blade made no sound against the wood. Behind the wall, Tate drew his gun from the holster. Reed walked around the table, sat beside Hale, and broke 4 fingers on his right hand in 3 seconds. Hale left the mansion in an ambulance. Sutton heard everything through the open kitchen door. The scream, Reed's low and even voice, and those 2 words, very obedient, dragged her backward through 7 years faster than any punch ever could. She placed the folding knife on the steel table and went upstairs to her room, not looking at Reed as she passed him in the kitchen doorway. That night, inside the silent house, Reed stood at the foot of the stairs and heard a sound he hadn't heard in 3 weeks. Click. She locked her bedroom door. And that tiny click sounded louder than bones breaking in the dining room, louder than Hale's scream, louder than any sound in Reed Ashford's entire life full of gunfire. The next morning, Mrs. Brogan placed the breakfast tray in front of Sutton's bedroom door. 1 hour later, the tray was still untouched. She went down to Reed's study and said 1 sentence. The girl didn't eat breakfast. Reed went up to the 2nd floor and knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked a 2nd time. No answer. His hand settled on the doorknob, on the steel bolt he had installed himself, and he realized she was using the lock he had given her to keep him outside. Sutton. He spoke into the door, his voice lower and softer than usual. Silence. Then the sound of the bolt sliding back. The door opened a crack. On the bed was a cloth bag, and inside it, clothes folded neatly, everything Reed had bought and Mrs. Brogan had left outside her door throughout the past 5 weeks, squared and stacked, ready to be returned. On the pillow, the folding knife lay with its blade open, pointed toward the door. She was carrying out the procedure 7 years had written into her. Decide she was a burden. Leave before being thrown out. I heard. I understand. I'm a risk. Her voice was flat, the voice of the machine. Reed stepped inside, didn't come closer, and sat down on the edge of the bed, his left hand still wrapped in the bandage from her stitches. Hale is lying in an ambulance with 4 broken fingers. I broke his hand because he opened his mouth and spoke about you in front of you. I didn't break his hand out of kindness, Sutton. 4 broken fingers were the only restraint I had left. Silence. If you go, I won't stop you. The door is open. The car has keys in the garage. But you're not leaving because the world outside is worse. You're leaving because you think you don't deserve to stay, and that is wrong. Sutton looked at him for a long time, searching for a crack, searching for a lie on his face. She didn't find one. She turned to the packed bag, unzipped it, and took the clothes out 1 piece at a time, placing them back into the closet. No words. Sweaters, jeans, t-shirts. Each item returning to the drawer was an answer that needed no language. The folding knife was still on the pillow. She didn't put it away. Reed didn't ask her to. He stood, walked out the door. And for the entire distance from her room to his study, he didn't turn the silver ring on his ring finger once. The news came the following afternoon through an encrypted call from one of Tate's men, planted inside the Castellano organization. Hale had joined forces with Voss, using money to hire the Castellano organization. 15 to 20 gunmen, the mansion as the target. 48 hours. The second target was Sutton. Voss wanted her back. Reed ordered the entire bodyguard team to be called in, and Mrs. Brogan to be evacuated by helicopter that night to the safe house in Connecticut. Then he went down to the kitchen to find Sutton. She was stirring a pot of soup in front of the gas stove, wearing the gray sweater and white sneakers, looking nothing like the skeletal girl from the warehouse 5 weeks earlier. He told her directly. Voss was coming. 48 hours. He had support, and there were many of them. He had arranged for her to leave with Mrs. Brogan on the helicopter. Sutton turned back to look at him. Her amber eyes were burning now, no longer dull. I've been running for 7 years. 3 escapes. 3 times caught again. Running never ends. I'm staying. Reed wanted to give an order. Wanted to tell Tate to lift her over his shoulder and put her on the helicopter. But he looked into her eyes and understood that forcing her to go would turn her back into an object being moved by someone else. Do you know how to shoot? I know how to stab. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly, but I learned fast. He led her down to the basement, to the shooting range built for the bodyguard team. 2 hours. Enough for her to know how to load, switch off the safety, and keep her hands steady. Hands used to holding knives learned to hold a gun so quickly that Reed felt both relief and pain. Relief because she could protect herself, pain because he knew she learned so fast, because she had lived her whole life in a state of combat. The helicopter took off after dark. "Mrs." Brogan stopped in front of Sutton, placed both hands on her shoulders, and said, "You listen to me. You live. Do you hear me?" Then she stepped onto the helicopter without looking back. Sutton stood in the hallway, watching the helicopter's red light blink in the night sky, her right hand gripping the folding knife in her pants pocket, her left hand clenched into a fist at her side, and inside that fist, she could still feel the warmth of Mrs. Brogan's 2 hands on her shoulders. They came earlier than expected. Midnight, in the middle of the biggest storm of the autumn. The power was cut at 11:47. The line severed with cutters at the utility pole 200 meters from the mansion. The entire mansion sank into darkness. The main security system died. The HD cameras died. The fire suppression system, the sprinklers, all of it died at the same time. Only the infrared cameras running on backup batteries and the mechanical lock on the safe room beneath the basement remained. 4 pickup trucks rammed straight through the iron gate. The Castellano team poured into the front yard, 12 to 15 men, heavily armed, spreading out and firing toward Reed's guards. Exactly as Reed had guessed, the entire security force was being pulled to the front, and from the seaside, from the cliff behind the mansion, where no one thought anyone could climb in a storm, Voss and Pike, along with a few gunmen, climbed up with ropes and iron hooks. Reed and Tate blocked Voss's group at the back door on the first floor. Reed fired with precision, 1 bullet at a time. Tate fought at close range in the narrow hallway, using the grip of his gun, his elbows, his knees. But there were more of them. The Castellano team began breaking through the front door. More dark figures climbed over the garden fence behind the house. The 2 fronts closed in. Then Tate was shot in the left calf. He dropped to 1 knee, hissing through his teeth, his hand still gripping the gun. Reed hooked his arm under Tate's shoulder, dragged him down the hallway, fired one-handed behind them, and pulled Tate to the safe room at the end of the hall. He shoved Tate inside, stepped in, pulled the steel door shut, turned the mechanical bolt. The sound of the lock sliding into place cut off every sound outside. In the safe room, beneath the dim red light, Reed leaned back against the steel door, breathing hard, and understood 2 things at once. Tate was safe. Sutton was upstairs on the 2nd floor, alone. On the 2nd floor, Sutton heard everything. The gunfire echoing through the wooden floor, the sound of glass breaking, the sound of men shouting. She didn't wait. 7 years had taught her that no one was coming to save her, and that the person who stood still was the first to die. She picked up the folding knife from under her pillow, took the half-full bottle of bourbon from the corner cabinet in the room, slipped off her shoes so she could move without sound, and climbed out through the bathroom window. The storm lashed her face instantly. She flattened herself against the slick roof tiles, her chest pressed down, her fingers gripping the grooves between the tiles, the bourbon bottle trapped between her stomach and the roof. Below her, heavy footsteps sounded on the 2nd floor stairs. Perry Voss's voice rose up, the voice that had lived inside every sleep she'd had for 7 years. The sound of her bedroom door being kicked. On the 3rd blow, the oak door burst open. Then Voss cursed. "She's not here." Pike checked the bathroom and saw the open window. Sutton waited until Voss's footsteps returned to the hallway, directly beneath the vent between 2 rows of roof tiles. She opened the bourbon bottle and poured it through the vent, listening as the liquor fell onto the wooden hallway floor below. Then she struck the back of the knife hard against the roof tile. A small spark caught the alcohol. A blue-orange flame licked along the bourbon-soaked wooden floor. Not enough to burn the house down, but enough to create thick black smoke that filled the hallway because the fire system had died with the power. Pike shouted Voss's name through the smoke, then fled through a 1st-floor window, disappearing into the night storm. Voss was trapped in the 2nd-floor hallway, coughing violently, unable to find his way out because he didn't have the map of this house inside his head. But Sutton did. She crawled along the roof to the window of Reed's master bedroom, climbed in, and went straight to the right-hand drawer of the bedside table. The gun was there, exactly where she had seen it in the 1st week, in the drawer Reed knew she had opened and had never locked afterward. She took the gun, checked the rounds, and switched off the safety. Then she stepped into the hallway. The smoke was thinning, and there, in the middle of it, 2 meters away from her, stood Voss. Thin face, silver hair, murky brown eyes, the face of 7 years. He saw her, opened his mouth. Sutton fired. No trembling, no closing her eyes. Voss fell. She stood and looked at him. Then she breathed. Deeply. Fully. For the first time in 7 years. Down in the basement, Reed heard one single gunshot, then silence. "Go," Tate said, his face white from blood loss, but his eyes clear. "I'm fine." Reed ran up to the second floor, through the thinning smoke, and saw Sutton standing at the end of the hallway. Barefoot, wet hair, sweater soaked through, alive. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "A scratch," he said. Sutton sat down on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, the gun resting on her thigh, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She sat like someone who had just set down the heaviest thing in her life and didn't yet know how to feel light. Reed walked over, didn't stand in front of her, didn't kneel down. He sat on the floor beside her, shoulder against shoulder. He didn't ask why she hadn't run, didn't say she was brave. He only sat. 5 minutes of silence. Only the sound of the rain dying outside and the breathing of 2 people on the smoke-stained wooden floor. "You need to bandage that." "Yeah, I can do it. I know." She stood first. She held her hand down to him, small, with dried blood between her fingers. Reed took it. She pulled him to his feet. They went down to the kitchen. The dim blue LED light beneath the range hood was still on, the most familiar light in this house. Sutton pushed Reed down onto the steel stool, his stool, took a clean kitchen towel and tore it into strips, washed the graze on his forearm with salt water, and wrapped the bandage tight enough. And while her hands worked, her mouth began to tell the story. Her voice was even, flat, her eyes on the strip of bandage. She told him she was taken when she was 20 years old at a bus station at 2 o'clock in the morning. Told him how many months she had spent in the basement. Told him about 3 escapes, 3 times being caught again, each time worse than the last. Told him she stitched her first wound herself when she was 21, using a needle taken from the trash. She didn't give details. She only listed it, short and clean, like reading from a list. But in every pause between 2 sentences, there was everything she didn't say and Reed didn't ask. She told him because tonight Voss had died at her feet, and 7 years had just ended, and for the first time, she had someone listening whom she wasn't afraid of. Reed sat still, let her bandage him, let her speak, didn't nod, didn't say, "I understand," only stayed silent and present. She tied the last strip. "Done?" Reed asked. "Done." "Then sit down." She sat. He stood, his newly bandaged hand throbbing sharply, walked to the gas stove, and poured cold coffee into 2 cups. The white ceramic mug was placed in front of her. The heavy glass was for him. Sutton lifted the mug, took a sip. Then she said, softly, almost in a whisper, her voice trembling at the edges for the first time that night, not from fear, but from something new she didn't yet have a name for. "This is the first cup of coffee that doesn't taste like fear." Reed lifted his glass and touched it lightly to the rim of the white ceramic mug on the table, a small clink in the kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the eastern horizon began to turn pale gray. Sutton Graves never said, "I'm staying." She simply didn't leave. She left books on the living room table, hung her coat on the hook by the kitchen door, and kept her white ceramic coffee mug on the shelf beside Reed's heavy glass tumbler. Small traces marking territory. She managed the kitchen, learned the accounts from Mrs. Brogan, and began sitting in the conference room when Reed met with partners, without being invited, and without anyone daring to send her out. 7 years of survival had taught her to read people better than any advisor Reed had ever hired, by watching their hands, not their eyes. One Wednesday evening, 8 months after the rainy night in the warehouse, Reed came home from a business trip. The kitchen lights were on. The air smelled of roasted meat and coffee. Sutton sat on the steel stool with one leg drawn up, reading a black leather ledger, a cold cup of coffee beside her elbow, the folding knife closed, and lying beside the book. She didn't look up. "The Southern distributor is falsifying the numbers." I marked page 14. Reed sat down on the stool across from her, opened to page 14, and began to read. No one said love. No one said stay. The night sea struck the cliff below. 2 people bent over the same ledger beneath the kitchen light. No one needed to say anything. This story isn't a fairy tale. It is a reminder that true kindness means giving someone else the right to choose, that healing is a long journey and not a miracle, and that human worth should never be measured by the amount someone paid to possess them. If this story touched you, please press like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel so you can listen each day to more stories worth telling. Please comment below and tell me which moment touched you most deeply. I read every comment, and every line you write gives this channel the strength to continue. I wish you and your loved ones good health, happiness, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.